in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
I think what we should think about when talking about VLA Max is the maximal rate of glycolysis or maximal glycolytic rate, because we can't measure the glycolysis itself, but we can measure one of the end products of glycolysis, which is lactate.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today I am joined by Benedict Meixner. He is a lecturer at the University of Erlangen and is doing a PhD with Dr. Billy Sperlich, who was on the show previously to talk all about training intensity distributions. That's being done at the University of Würzburg in Germany, and Benedict primarily studies VLA Max in cycling, which is always a little bit of an interesting topic when you bring it up to people. So I'm really excited to dive into the topic of VLA Max, how to determine VLA Max in sprint cycle testing, and just kind of the physiology behind it. So Benedict, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, man. So interesting story. Benedict was actually the one who spurred me getting Dr. Sperlich onto the show, which is really awesome because I posted, probably a training intensity distribution, paper that you might have been on, but definitely Dr. Sperlich was on, and he was like, and you were like, hey, you should get Billy on the show. So I reached out to him. I was like, oh, there's no way, Dr. Sperlich's a busy guy, like those sort of things. And then sure enough, he came on, and it was one of my favorite conversations just because of the way that Dr. Sperlich thinks. So just being in that lab, I'm sure is pretty amazing. And I'm sure, you guys have a lot more irons in the fire than just, say VLA Max. Like what else is the Sperlich lab studying right now?
I can't really say I'm in the lab. As I work in Erlangen, and that's a 1 hour drive to Würzburg.
Gotcha.
So I'm doing, or I did most of my study in Erlangen. And basically the first year, Billy and I, we only Zoomed.
Mm-hmm.
And and we messaged over WhatsApp. So that was basically all of our conversations. So yeah, it took us over a year to meet face to face.
Wow.
Now I know what they're doing a bit more, but I can't really say I'm in the lab.
That's fair. Yeah. That's fair. So what do you lecture? Like, what sort of courses and stuff do you lecture at Erlangen?
Most of them are practical courses. So I teach basketball.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. And some other like small-sided games, and there's one theoretical course that goes into basics of kinesiology, training exercise physiology. But most of my courses that I teach are practical, so in the gym.
Fun. So is that kind of how you got into, exercise physiology and had the research interest, or is there more to that?
So basically, I first studied to become a teacher.
Okay.
But not a teacher at the university level, but at school. And then I had 2 subjects, and then I added sports or exercise to or physical education, I guess it's called in English, to that. And when I studied that, I worked in the lab in our university, where I also did my study right now. And yeah, it's not a lab where people take part in studies, but it's more a sports medicine lab where people get tested for cardiometabolic fitness and health and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always liked the work in the lab, and somehow I got interested in, well, when there's two people that have the same VO2 max, why is there a difference in their, I mean, I don't know, let's call it just threshold, because there's also so much controversy about what that is, but let's just say
I've
threshold.
gotten into that a few times on the podcast and on my Instagram, so you're in good company there.
Yes, but so I wondered what determines threshold? So like fractional utilization of VO2 max, and yeah, basically that led me down the rabbit hole to VLA Max and so on. And then I was interested enough in doing more on that, not necessarily a PhD, but basically that's the most common thing that you do when you do studies, so why not? And yeah, there I am.
Cool. Do you have like a sporting background as well?
Yeah, I first was a swimmer for the first like 20 years of my life. Then
Okay.
with the age of 14, 15, 16, I started playing basketball, and I had a CrossFit phase as well.
Yep.
And recently I've gotten into cycling a bit.
Nice. Yeah, that's I had my trajectory was endurance sport, but I was on the running side of things. So cross country running, track, like those sort of things. And then I got into triathlon in college. I was on the rowing team, like very briefly. And then got out of college, was like really into like mountain running and stuff. Got into CrossFit for a little while, and now I'm back to the endurance side of things, what I talk about on my Instagram all the time. But yeah, cycling super fun. I'm fortunate enough I have what would it be? It's 500 feet of elevation gain down and up to a river right out of my back door. So I can like go down the hill, up the hill as many times as I want. And I'll run sometimes. Most of the time I hike, and I wear like a 20-pound like rucksack, sort of thing. So that's my stuff right now. But I cycle a lot, and I've found that is a very, very amazing way to stay in shape and reduce your risk of injury, because running, I'm almost always injured, doing running and doing stupid stuff like that. Cool, man. Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time to, lend your expertise to the show and everything. And I think, before we jump into VLA Max, I first want to establish for people just like, what is lactate? Where does it come from? And how do we measure it, essentially? Because you said you were interested in the fractional utilization of, your percentage of VO2 max, and that's really kind of one of the all three, predictors of performance, efficiency, second threshold, and VO2 max are a combination of are really good for predicting endurance performance. But that second threshold is really where you're going to be exercising at if you're doing, like performances that are between 1 and 2 hours. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving us a background of just like, what is lactate? Where does it come from? And then how can we measure it? I think that'll give us a good starting point to then start to expand and go into VLA Max.
Okay, so I think to make it easy, lactate, the way I think of it in this case especially, is basically half a sugar. So lactate is the intermediary between the anaerobic and aerobic pathways, but basically it's the product of glycolysis or glycogenolysis. So when we exercise at heavy intensities, we need glycolysis, and then lactate is produced within the muscle and then is shuttled into the bloodstream, where we measure it most commonly at the earlobe. At least that's the way we do it in Germany. I think there's some national differences where people do that. But yeah, we measure at the earlobe. You could also do it at the fingertip or at the toe tip. I guess that's common for rowers.
Oh, that makes sense with rowers if it's on the toe. I was gonna say, what cyclist is gonna let somebody like take off their shoe, poke their toe, and then measure it from there? But it makes sense if it's in rowers.
Yeah, and You can do that with a handheld device or with a lab device. So basically, the lab devices are pretty expensive. The handheld devices are nowadays available for a couple €100 or I guess dollars as well. So yeah.
Yeah, something that I want to just iterate to people is that when you're measuring blood lactate, the lactate that is leaking into the blood or accumulating in the blood is the balance of what is being produced through anaerobic glycolysis by, say, primarily type 2 fibers, and what is then being absorbed and oxidized in the mitochondria. So it's really the balance between the two. So if you have really, really robust mitochondrial populations, then you could have an individual going all out, or if they're in a little bit of a carbohydrate depleted state as well, you could have somebody going all out and their lactate accumulation in the blood may not be that high, but it's because they're uptaking most of the lactate that is being produced from the type 2 fibers in their type 1 fibers. So that's the first step, is lactate will start to accumulate. It leaks out into the capillaries. It can then be uptaken into the mitochondria of, more robustly populated mitochondrial fibers like type 1 fibers. And then the lactate that doesn't get absorbed or doesn't get oxidized by those fibers then leaks out into the blood. And that's where you start to see that accumulation of blood lactate.
Yes, exactly. But just to quickly interject here, because people often mention that we could also do biopsies of the muscle where lactate is produced. But that's the disadvantage of measuring lactate at the earlobe, is that you have those processes that you just mentioned, but also you measure at least a part of all the lactate that has been produced. But if I take a biopsy of, let's say, the quads, I just measure a single fiber or a couple fibers of the quads, and there's not even the cycling are only the quads active, but the calves, the glutes as well. So you would need to measure or take at least a couple of biopsies or at different spots to be able to have a comparative value. But yeah, it's got upsides and downsides measuring the concentration at the earlobe, where you have some processes in between.
Yeah, and I will say, like I always point out, limitations or what I call considerations for any measurement that I'm ever making. And with lactate, especially like if it's at the earlobe or the finger, it's just you're pricking your finger, and it's a little uncomfortable. You're just getting a drop of blood. But I will say, from an invasive to non-invasive spectrum, a muscle biopsy is much more invasive and requires a lot more expertise in terms of, like, you're almost doing like a minor surgery. Like you're making an incision in the leg, wherever you're taking the muscle biopsy from. You have to be able to properly set the Bergstrom needle. I did these during my PhD. Well, I didn't do them personally. I watched my advisors do probably hundreds of these during my PhD. And it is a very involved process that requires, a sterile field, surgical sort of tools, like other things like that. So anybody who is saying, well, the alternative is to do a muscle biopsy, I would say, the benefits and the considerations, like you were talking about, with like the lactate, is like, if you want to know what the whole body lactate accumulation is, just measure it in the earlobe, and then just say, okay, well, we have a little black box that is the muscle and, the type 1, type 2 fibers. And we're just going to assume, that the accumulation is the accumulation, right? So it's just identifying, like what it is. So I appreciate that you're pointing that out, because I'm sure you've had people ask that in the past. We're like, oh, just take a muscle biopsy and then measure, like the flux of lactate, within like the type 2 fibers and the type 1 fibers. And it's like, it would be so hard to extrapolate to a whole body perspective, like what was actually going on. And that's what we run into with near infrared spectroscopy is I always have to remind people, hey, that's a local measure. Like if you're wearing it and cycling, say on the vastus lateralis, yeah, that's the primary mover or one of the primary movers, but it's not the only one. So that muscle oxygenation isn't going to be 100% indicative of what's actually going on from a whole body perspective. And that's where you have to start to consider, doing measurements like NIRS, lactate, heart rate, ventilation response, and like putting all of those to get like more of a context of full physiological, sort of outputs and those sort of things. But today we are talking about lactate, and the next thing. So we kind of talked about the production of lactate and other things like that. And a lot of people use lactate to determine first and second threshold, right? The first inflection point where lactate goes kind of from like steady state or resting values to higher steady state or resting values. And then the second lactate threshold is where lactate concentrations, and these are loose definitions, but lactate concentrations go from essentially steady, so maximal lactate steady state, to unsteady, where if you're exercising at exercise intensities higher than second threshold, your lactate is just going to keep going up and up and up and up, and eventually you're going to reach some level of fatigue, which is commensurate with like VO2 max. But there's another value here that is kind of new to the block, and it might not be that new actually, so you can kind of give us the history of it, but it's called VLA Max. My definition is it's the highest rate of lactate production into the blood following sprint exercise, but give us your definition, because you're actually you've had multiple papers now published on VLA Max. What's your definition of VLA Max?
I don't have an own definition, but I think what we should think about when talking about VLaMax is the maximal rate of glycolysis, or maximal glycolytic rate, because we can't measure the glycolysis itself, but we can measure one of the end products of glycolysis, which is lactate, and that we can measure in the blood. And yeah, I think it's now the original thesis is now 4 years old this year.
Yeah. It's pretty wild, because in the United States, it's Mater and Heck, right, are the originators of this thought process. Like, it is still, at least in some circles, fairly uncommon, to know about these amazing, German scientists who came up with this kind of physiological model that's now been around for 40 years. Obviously, there's been some people who have tweaked it and like other things like that, but ultimately, it was a I would say that being able to come up with something just based off of, like what they could measure 40 years ago now is pretty interesting. So could you go in, like, maybe I'm not trying to grill you like, PhD defense or anything like that, but could you go into a little bit of historical detail on what the modern model is, and then how that's kind of evolved over time in a sense?
Also, I can also take kind of a detour to how I got into the topic. So,
Yeah.
I wondered why is threshold where it is, and also why is the body, like, for example, why can't we exercise at VO2 max for longer? Because
Right.
why does the body need to produce lactate at this point when we are at like, let's say, full aerobic capacity? And then I got into the model that Mater he first published in German, which is, I think, one of the problems, that it's not as recognized as maybe it should be, maybe it could be. And there's only 2 papers from him out there. One was published in 1986, and then he advanced the model and published that in 2003, I think. And it's a lot of calculations and simulations. I think that's why it's pretty tough to understand, and also that didn't help its popularity.
Yeah.
But it basically, the way I understand it is essentially the muscle cell just takes energy from where it's good at. Like if you're if the muscle is not good at aerobic energy, it relies more or sooner on glycolysis.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the other way around, then it can take really long for glycolysis to set in because the muscle is really strong in its aerobic pathway, so it does not need to rely on glycolysis as soon. So
Mm-hmm.
like as soon if we talk about like step testing or increasing load, so then the muscle cell itself just takes where it's good at, and then there's no glycolysis if it's really good at aerobic energy production, and the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And everything in between, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, so his models essentially, like kind of stated that then, right? Is you're either relying, very heavily on glycolysis, or you're relying really heavily on fatty acid oxidation, essentially within the mitochondria for your ATP production, and then everything in between. And in that process, he came up with these models that are still being used, right? They're really heavily used in like VLA Max, and there's some companies that are out there that are really leaning very heavily on this interplay between, well, is your muscle and is your body able to use more of that oxygen, or is it more heavily on the glycolytic side? So yeah, could you like, where does then VLA Max come in? Because I've heard it, kind of be compared to VO2 max in a sense, where VO2 max is your highest oxygen consumption capacity, whereas VLA Max is your highest glycolytic, capacity. So how do those two kind of interact, right? It seems like it's a little bit of a teeter-totter, but it's challenging.
So basically, as VO2 max is maximal aerobic capacity, there has to be some threshold below that, and a VLaMax just basically determines where that point is. So for the same VO2 max, if I have a higher VLaMax, then it means that my glycolytic system is stronger, and that means it kicks in sooner. So there's more glycolysis going on at lower intensities, and therefore the threshold also occurs sooner or at lower intensities. And also the other way around. So if my glycolysis is then weaker, then threshold occurs at higher intensities. But also, like people mostly stop thinking about intensities at VO2 max. But it also means that a lower VLA max means I'm weaker at intensities that rely just on glycolysis. So sprints obviously above VO2 max intensity.
Mm-hmm. Just because you don't have the capacity to oxidize as much glucose as you would need, and we know that glycolysis is a very rapid way of producing ATP.
Yes, exactly.
It's the second fastest. Well, if we call anaerobic glycolysis, which is the portion outside of the mitochondria, if we are just talking about that, it's the second fastest, ATP rate, compared to, I guess the fastest would be the phosphogen system, but we know that is highly limited, right? So, the phosphogen system, what's the, and we'll get into this, I guess, in your studies, but what's like the current idea of how long you're reliant on your phosphogen system before you're then overtaken by glycolysis, like within a sprint? Isn't it like 4 to 6 seconds? And I think it depends on who you ask and what they use.
Also, there's especially when looking at the VLA Max topic, there's quite the discussion about how much glycolysis is actually going on
Hmm.
during the testing procedure, and how much of the power output is determined by the phosphogen system. So yeah,
Yeah, I know. It's the more you dig into this sort of stuff, the more you realize it's not those pretty curves that they show you in exercise physiology class, where it's like, oh, the phosphogen system goes up and provides most of the ATP for the first 10 seconds, and then we switch over to the glycolytic system. Then we switch over. It's like, no, no, no. Everything's always working. And there was a paper that was published in 2001 by Schulman and Rothberg. Oh man, I'm probably messing this up, but essentially they call it the glycogen shunt model. And essentially what's happening is they say that between contractions on the millisecond scale, so from like 0, it's like 0 to 15 milliseconds, then 15 to 100 milliseconds, and then, like the relaxation period, there's different portions that are dominated by, different energy substrate. So it's like for 0 to 15 is something like the phosphogen system. This is milliseconds. Then 15 to 100 is the glycolytic system is kicking in, plus it's using that ATP to then replenish phosphocreatine. And then between contractions, that's when the mitochondria and glycolysis then act to replenish the phosphogen system. So it's like it just gets the more you dive in and the more fidelity you have within your readings. Like they're doing all of this with like phosphomagnetic resonance spectroscopy. The more and more complicated like all of this stuff gets, because your muscle is so good at responding to the energy demands that are required for force output that it's not just happening on a second by second basis. Your brain isn't, or your muscle isn't refreshing every 1 second. It's like it's responding, to the probably like whatever faster than a millisecond actually is in order to maintain energy balance. Or else we would, as soon as we decided to start sprinting, we would just collapse from rigor, right?
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so it is really interesting where, like even the rate of maximal glycolytic rate could still be semi-dominated by, the phosphogen system in a sense, but it's all interconnected. So it's like we're trying to get at, well, what's your capacity for non-aerobic metabolism, what's your capacity for aerobic metabolism, and then what's the interplay. And I think that's potentially where what VLA Max is trying to do, is it's trying to figure out that non-aerobic rate that we can maintain or supply. So we've talked a lot about, kind of just like the idea of VLA Max. And now we're starting to get into like more testing procedures, because there's a lot of different recommendations out there based on the time that you do it, how often you should measure lactate, other things like that. What is the standard VLA Max protocol that you do in your lab when you're doing your studies?
So we took the 15-second all-out sprint test.
Mm-hmm.
I think 15 seconds is the most common. Basically, all the recent studies that came out and mentioned VLaMax either tested 15 seconds or included some kind of 15-second tests.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we tested a 15-second all-out test as well. But also there's the need for relatively high-end equipment, because there's or you should be able to measure at like not 1 hertz the power output, but
Mm-hmm.
like let's say at least 5 hertz, or preferably 10 hertz, or even more.
Right.
And also one requirement, at least the way I think about it, is that the ergometer should be capable of isokinetic mode.
I was
So
going to
that
ask about
means,
that.
yeah. So that means basically, for those who don't know, it's basically the same as erg mode, but in erg mode is set to watts, and in isokinetic mode, the ergometer is set to cadence. So We set our ergometer to 130 revolutions per minute. And then the ergometer just stays at that cadence and just gives the resistance so that the participant is able to put out as much power as he or she is able to at that cadence.
And you know, the cadence is important to clamp because then you're not getting changes to, say, like efficiency or other things like that that can be introduced with other cadences, right? If you had somebody at 100, 110, 120, 130, I'm sure you'd probably get different power outputs just based off of those. What's the rationale between 130? Like, why not 140 or 120?
You could probably do those. If you want to be really exact, you should probably test people before to see where their maximum power output is. So yeah, that would require quite extensive pre-testing. And also recently, I think there was a study where they tested participants at different cadences, and they found that if you go higher, your maximal rate of glycolysis or maximum rate of lactate accumulation is higher, but power output is lower. So then there's the question: which one do we go for? Do we go for maximum power output, or do we go for maximum lactate accumulation?
Right.
Yeah.
I know. And this is something, this is so fascinating to me because this is the same sort of questions that I would get during my PhD is like, you know, like, well, why did you choose this protocol? And what I will tell to people is like, we as researchers are doing our best to make educated guesses or educated in being as informed as possible on the procedures that we're doing so that they are controllable and we are controlling as many variables as possible. And, you know, there's people out there who poo-poo on, you know, like research, you know, some research stuff where they're like, oh, well, you know, like research never goes beyond 4 weeks in terms of exercise training and those sort of things. It's like, well, have you ever tried to run a 4-week training study? It's freaking hard and it costs a lot of money. So like until we get more people paying more money to do research and stuff, like we're not going to be able to do that. So that's just like kind of my rant is that when I'm asking, you know, you Benedict about this, I'm not, you know, trying to be like, you know, like a dick about, you know, like, oh, why not 125 or 135? I'm just interested in the rationale behind it. Because if you ask any good researcher or scientist about their protocols, they should have good rationale because that's how you're taught to design studies is you have rationale for what you're doing. And there's always going to be limitations, you know, to anything that you do. So yeah. So, okay. So in summary right now, VLA Max, if I recall from your study, you do, what is that, 10-minute warm up at, is it 1.5 watts per kilo or 1?
Yes. 1.5.
1.5 watts per kilo. Have like a 3-minute break and then do the 15 second. So you do 15-second all out sprint on a electronically braked cycle ergometer that can be set to isokinetic mode. Isokinetic mode clamps the RPMs, not the power output, which then allows your participants to pedal at 130 RPMs. So they do their they do their 15 seconds all out, and then we also got to do lactate measurements. So where do those come in?
Just to add onto that, because we talked about the ergometer, some people will say that you should only do that kind of testing on an SRM ergometer.
Okay.
There's 2 disadvantages to that. One, it's really, really expensive.
Yeah. Okay. So how much money are we talking for? Like, you guys use what? Like this? Was it a Cyclist or Cyclops 2?
No, it's a Cyclist 2.
Cyclist 2.
Yeah, that's a common lab ergometer in Germany, I would say.
Okay.
or
And
in Europe.
like, do you know how much it actually costs to get one of those?
Around 15K.
15K. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
So not your Wahoo kicker.
No.
And then how much does an SRM cost? Because I'm sure
Uh,
that's even more.
yeah, more than double that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
And the advantage of the cyclist is that you can install the bikes of the participants, so they're really familiar with the setup because they're on
mhm,
their own bike, they're sitting on their own saddle, they got their own crank length. If most people or some people are not even sure about their crank length,
mhm,
they got on the bike and just pedal. So
mhm.
if you get them into your lab and you have to set the crank length, they don't know, and you can make sure that this is their common crank length.
Right.
And also they're familiar to their handlebar setup and so on.
Mhm.
So that you could potentially set the SRM up like that, but still then the saddle is not the same. The handlebar also probably grips differently. Yeah. So I think we can argue for the cyclist,
Yeah.
apart from it being cheaper.
Yeah. And what we find sometimes too is that there's always a sweet spot in terms of how much something costs, like cost benefit sort of ratios and other things like that. And it seems like I'm thinking about this from like the test that I've done in the past, where I mean, we had some really, really nice, and I can't even remember what they're called, but like, like the electronically braked cycle ergometers and other things, but we weren't able to get the person on their own bike. I would prefer somebody be on their own bike, be as comfortable as possible, and then control, if you can control the cadence, then, that gets you most of the way there in terms of what you're trying to measure anyways. Allow them to be as comfortable as possible, takes away a little bit of like that white coat effect, right? Somebody comes in, they're a little nervous, for testing. And you guys do, I know, multiple tests, which also gets rid of or, changes that comfortability. But yeah, that's okay. So, so that's another consideration, right? Is you're trying to figure out what's the best, ergometer to use. Now let's go to what else are you measuring? Are you measuring things like obviously power output? Are you measuring like heart rate, like VO2, VCO2? Like, do you do any of that? And then obviously lactate's the big one that we're gonna get to.
Yeah. So we had our participants also, or we tested their hydration
Mm-hmm.
status and also their blood glucose. And we also measured their VO2 and VCO2 for the first test that we did. We had our participants come in 3 times. But because of decreased reliability, and we did the spiral test only for the first test, we did not look at that yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that would be interesting. Because you can kind of get an indication of CO2 production, which obviously above an RER of 1.1, you get excess CO2 production. Is there, this is just my curiosity, is there any correlation between the excess CO2 production ability and the relationship between lactate accumulation in the blood?
I haven't looked at the recorded data, but from looking at the live data when I undertook my testing, I would say so. Yes.
Yeah, because that would be really interesting, right? If we could somehow use the VO2 VCO2, have that correlate to some level of lactate production, and then it's like it's always just more information, right? Like what is the excess CO2 actually telling us? Relationship between uh, lactate production, because we're still measuring VO2. So then we could actually start to measure in real time the same thing, like VO2 plus VC, and then use the VCO2 as more of the glycolytic side of things. And then you could actually start to see that teeter totter maybe playing into effect. I don't
Yep.
know. Cool. So you did it for the first one, or for the first test, you were measuring, the spirometry and metabolic. You're doing a metabolic analysis, but you stopped doing that because of the reliability of the test, which makes sense. Like when you're sprinting all out, having a mask on, or whatever apparatus it is that you have on your metabolic cart, I can see that getting in the way a little bit of of the reliability of the sprint. So you want a really good sprint, obviously, right? That's first and foremost the most important thing. And then the other variables come along with it. From what I read, you're measuring lactate at rest. So do you do it before the warm up? Is it like before the warm up, after the warm up, before the test, and then every 1 minute following?
No, so I had them perform the warm up first, and then they had a 3 minute resting period, and at the end of this period, we took 2 resting lactate samples. So the resting period is also important because obviously you want your participants to be warmed up, but then as mentioned, we have the problem that lactate is taken up into the mitochondria and gets metabolized and so on, and we don't want that because then lactate does not show up at the earlobe. So
Right.
We want to reduce the oxidative side of things as much as possible. So then we could also go for a longer resting period, like 5 or 10 minutes, to decrease the aerobic side of things. We went for 3 because of we had rather extensive testing after the VLaMax test as well, and we also wanted to not force our participants to be there for more than 2 hours.
Yeah. And this is one of those things, the rationalization. I love it because, you're like, when you first conceive of a study, or at least when I first conceived of studies, it's like, oh, we're going to measure this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this. And then you start to get to the real, application of it. And you're like, I think my participants are going to have to be here for 8 hours a day for 4 days in a row. And then you have to start to say, okay, well, what's going to be the most optimal here in terms of time? Because, I've participated in studies and I've, run studies. And I think one of the things that we always need to be aware of is just be respectful of the individual that you're getting in, because they're volunteering their time, to be part of your studies and other things like that. So I'm sure they appreciated, a little bit less rest. Obviously it's that balance between, staying warm right after a warm up and not having too much stimulation of the oxidative, phosphorylation of the mitochondria. But if you're standardizing it, right, then you're doing your best to control what's going on. So we got to the 3 minute rest. You take 2 samples, and then 15 seconds all out. And then is it every minute following, or is it okay? So it's 15 seconds, and then a minute 15 seconds, 2 minutes 15 seconds, 3 minutes 15 seconds?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
So I took 1 lactate sample immediately after the sprint, and then that's where my timer started basically, and I just took 1 sample every minute. There's 2 ways to do that. You go for a set amount, or that's probably easier if you do it with a handheld device, because you get the measurements directly after. You do it until lactate decreases reliably. So if you get 1 peak value at 5 minutes, and then at minute 6 and 7 it's lower, then you can assume that your highest value was at 5 minutes. Or you just take like 8 or 9 samples and you just look for the highest value. What I found was that most people had their peak at 5 or 6 minutes. So I think 8 minutes 8 minutes is enough for pretty much. I did not have anybody with a peak at 9 minutes.
Yeah. But you built in some level of flexibility where you were continually taking that. And then this is where like I just didn't have enough time to like read up on where the, like kind of like your protocols and stuff. But then from there, you just took all these lactate values where it's like, okay, immediately following the 15 seconds, it's a little high, but then it gets higher and higher and higher and higher for 5 minutes. And then are you looking, like, what are you looking for in terms of how do you determine VLA max? Is it the slope of that curve, or is it the highest point, or is it the change, like the delta lactate? What's the, like, how do you actually determine it? Because I have read papers in the past and I'm like, this isn't explaining to me exactly how I should be measuring it.
We took just the difference between resting lactate levels and peak lactate levels after sprint.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
so just the resting, I've seen people in the past do something along the lines of like the delta and then dividing it by some time. So it's like the time of the sprint minus, is it T4 or something like that? Like it's the TPCR.
Yes.
To try.
So that's another rabbit hole. Because obviously we have the maximal rate of glycolysis. So rate is always something over time.
Right.
And so we need a time component in that test. One way to do it would just be to say we have delta lactate and we divide it by test duration, which would be 15 seconds in that case. The other way, and that's also the way it was originally described in the VLaMax testing thesis by Weber, is he came up with a with TPCR, so phosphogen contribution time in essence. And that's the problem. There's multiple definitions for that time.
Yeah.
So one definition is it's the time until you reach your peak power output. Another definition is it's the time until you reach your peak power output, and then your power output decreases by 3.5%.
Okay.
And that value comes from the accuracy of the original SRM ergometer. The error accuracy of that was 2.5%. And then it was just, well, let's take a 1% reduction of peak power output and add onto that the error accuracy. So then we have a reliable drop in 1%. And that's how that definition came into place. So there's two definitions. At least one is based in the SRM.
Yep.
A third way would be to just say the phosphogen contribution time is just 3.5 seconds or another fixed value. But that would just be the same as taking just test duration. Then it's just a matter of calibration. I think what your VLaMax is. So
it's just that number, because you're dividing by a constant, is as long as you're doing the same test over and over, it wouldn't really matter. But if you had changes to, say the time it took for you to reach your peak power output, and you did that as your duration, then that's going to change potentially your, VLA max. Man, dude, this sounds exactly like some of the papers I read during my master's degree, where it was like comparing ventilatory thresholds to lactate thresholds. And one of them, I think they used 21 different definitions of second thresholds for lactate. And it was like another 13 or something for ventilatory thresholds, maybe a little less, like maybe 4 or 5. But it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many different definitions based on, and all of these are rationalized, right? You can look up papers that have rationalizations for all of these different ways of measuring things. But what I always talk about is if you're going to measure something and you want to measure something over and over and over again, pick a protocol and stick with that protocol, because that's going to give you the ability to compare to yourself. Like most of the time, it probably doesn't matter if you're comparing, to other people, because we just want to know what the trends in your data are. And that's from a coaching perspective. From a research perspective, you have to standardize it so then you can compare people to other people, right? That's why with VO2 max testing, there's a lot of recommendations in terms of how that VO2 max test should be done, and then how it should be relativized, divide by, kilograms. And then that's how we can compare, like a cross-country skier to an elite level cyclist, right? We say, well, their VO2 max is this, their VO2 max is this, and then you can compare. Okay. So rant done. But you guys just chose the delta essentially, right? From resting to peak.
What we found was that the delta of lactate is pretty reliable over 3 tests, or over tests 2 and 3, if we consider the first one a familiarization with the protocol. And also power outputs are really, really reliable.
Okay.
And then there's the first problem with the testing protocol, is that the TPCR, or the phosphogen contribution time, is not reliable.
Right, because you can't really measure that, right? That's based on empirical data that.
Yeah. So first, that's why you need an ergometer with a high hertz number to measure power. Because if you take just a Wahoo kicker or something like that, that gives you 1 second measurements, and you can't really say this happened after 3.3 and there it happened after 3.8 seconds, because it just gives whole numbers. And also the problem was that the time is not the same for a single participant all the time, or it's not reliable. And it's also dependent on peak power output. So if we take like the 2 archetypes of a sprinter and a let's say diesel or endurance type, the sprinter is capable of producing that power really quick. So they reach their peak power output really, really quickly. And so they reach the time to peak quickly, and also the drop off really quickly after that. So they also reach the time to peak minus 3.5% quickly. Sometimes that happens within 1 second or 1.5 seconds. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, where somebody reaches peak power output after like 5 seconds. And then the 3.5% less than that after 6 seconds. So there's potential for like 3, 4, 5 seconds of difference in there in a 15-second test.
That will change your VLA Max a lot more,
yes,
than changes to lactate, which is really what the important thing is here, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's why we went on to just look at the delta lactate. But also I think that the phosphogen contribution time is also like a controversial topic, because there's discussion about whether it exists or where it exists in the muscle, in the blood, and so on. But it's just like we didn't want to say this one is bad, this one is good, we should do this or that. We just wanted to describe what happens, and say, well, there is something in the delta lactate, and physiological differences between people can be described by the delta lactate. But we shouldn't probably do that with or by including a non-reliable marker in the calculation of VLaMax.
Yep.
We could also just choose a fixed value, but then there will be people who say, why did you do that? And
right,
that it just complicates matters.
Yep. That's fair. Yeah. Okay. So right now the idea is that Because ultimately what I think we should supply to people is like a potential recommendation, like if they want to, measure it as like a coach or something like that, which I know that gets sticky, right? But so right now, your rationale for it, like the studies that you do has been to use the delta lactate, maximal lactate values minus the resting values, and then do you divide it by the time of the test? That's the time component.
No, we didn't do that.
It's literally just the delta lactate.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to, they can just divide the values by 15 and then have a VLA Max, or they can just take a fixed value for TPCR of 3.5 seconds and divide by 11.5 seconds and have a value.
Yeah. So however they do it, if they want to do like a meta-analysis or something like that, they can compare your data to other people's data essentially.
Yes.
Well, they can try. Okay. So let's actually, I have a link to an article that you sent me, because I think I sent like the wrong one that actually did talk about this whole TPCR conundrum and like other things like that. But there's a really cool study that was recently published. You're the first author, and Dr. Spurlick's the last author, right? I'll link in the show notes to this. But can you so essentially what you were trying to test is what can predict VLA Max, right? What are the predictors? What are the physiological predictors of VLA Max? And then do they differ between males and females? Is that kind of the overarching idea of the study? Probably a little too simplified, honestly.
Yeah, and not too simplified, but actually quite the other way around. We just wanted to know if VLA Max is connected to power output during a sprint. Because basically it's used for the simulation models for endurance exercise. But the way I thought about it was always to see if VLaMax is used to predict endurance power output, but tested in sprint power output, we should first look at whether it's related to sprint power output.
Yes.
And
I'm clapping right now because I love that. That's actually been one of my biggest, kind of hesitations with using VLA Max is like there's been a lot of talk about using VLA Max, right, to predict endurance output. Like, is it 0.3 or lower, or, whatever that threshold is for like, being like a good endurance athlete, or is it higher? And then that's going to, basically say, oh, well, you're probably more of a sprinter. But first and foremost, like we got to test, guys, if VLA Max is related to peak power output, to begin with. So, okay, that's great. That's perfect rationale here. So keep going. What's more of the rationale behind the study that you did, and then we can get into methods and stuff.
Well, yeah, we basically that was also part of the one we did with reliability. So we had overall 50 participants, and 30 of them were male, 20 of them were female.
And that's for those of you who have read a significant amount of research papers. 50 individuals being tested is a lot, and then having the mix of 30 and 20. I was just impressed, by the numbers. So give you kudos for that too. That was awesome.
Thank you. But also I have to give kudos to my participants, because most people, when they first heard I'm doing a study with VLA Max, they were like, okay, I'm coming tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So people were really excited to do something related to that topic, and to be able to talk to somebody who they thought knows something about the topic. I didn't at that point, or not as much as I do now, but yeah. And I still think I don't know enough about the topic, but people were really excited to participate, and I really appreciated that. And I had to actually stop at 50.
You had a line out the door of people who were just like, just do the test. You're like, maybe when I come up with maybe when I need to do another study, I'll get you guys on. Oh man, yeah, that is a great problem to have. In terms of your research area topic, because when I was doing some of my studies, it was like we would talk to 100 people, and we get probably 10% of those people would actually come in, for like informed consent. And then maybe five, but 1 to 5 people would then actually, no, once we got people in, it was pretty much like 90% retention, but still it was like 10%. So in order to get, 20, 30 people, I had to talk to upwards of 300. And so it can be tough, but that's awesome that you had lines out the door. It seems like it's like Black Friday sales in the United States, just people waiting to get in to do the VLaMax testing. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then I was interested in how we determine if VLaMax just explains differences in power output.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that is not surprising is that power output in the sprint is related to body mass, or to take a better predictor to fat-free mass.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that was expected, and
Right.
that is also the case in our study. And
so going in, did you have that hypothesis of more muscle mass equals more potential for glycolysis to occur? Therefore, the hypothesis is that there's going to be a positive correlation between fat-free mass and power output, and then fat-free mass and VLA max.
Yeah, so the power output and fat-free mass, that one was expected.
Yeah.
And then there's a problem that if we take absolute values of power output, then we cannot directly compare it to VLaMax or to delta lactate, because that is a measure of concentration. And obviously, if you have one person of 50 kilo body mass or fat-free mass, and one person of 80 kilos or 100 kilos, and they have the same concentration, obviously the person with a higher body weight or body mass and fat-free mass will have produced more lactate.
Mm-hmm.
Because the distribution space for lactate, whether it's the blood or other muscles and so on, is way higher if you're heavier or if you have more fat-free mass.
Right.
So you cannot compare it directly. But if you take relative values, then the influence of fat-free mass gets lost.
Right.
So there was the approach to determine a metabolic equivalent in the early 1960s, I think in Italy, and they calculated how much energy is or how much work is being done for a change in lactate values, and they just assumed that this glycolytic contribution is the change in lactate values times body weight or body mass.
Okay.
So what we did is, because Mader in his papers also describes that fat-free mass should be used as distribution space and not total body mass, because lactate is not distributed in fat mass. Then we calculated that as some proxy marker of total lactate production.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the problem?
Is that the total glycolytic? I can't remember what the exact name is.
Yeah, it's either like total lactate production or it's glycolytic contribution.
Glycolytic energy contribution. That's where it is. So now we're going through. Yeah, we're going through this paper now, and like I said, I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah. So we basically did that to calculate the glycolytic contribution as the delta lactate has changed in concentration, and we just assumed half of fat-free mass as the distribution space. But because we used regression models to see or to look for the correlations between power output and glycolytic contribution, it does not matter what part of or what fraction of fat-free mass we use as distribution space. We could also just like use 10% or 100% of that.
Right.
But we just went after Marder's calculations, and those basically say 50% of fat-free mass. And yeah, we found that this relationship is, or that glycolytic contribution explains over 80% of the difference in power output between individuals. And
Yeah, that's a lot. Like most of the time you can get significant, R squared values. Like, and when I say significant R squared values, like p values of less than 0.01, with R squared values sometimes in like the range of maybe 0.3, maybe 0.4. But just to emphasize how strong this actually is, that yours was like 0.82. I was literally just looking at the graph. So that means that 82% of the variance in power output was explained by this, I'm going to read it, glycolytic energy contribution, which is the combination of delta lactate and fat-free mass or distribution space. So you're actually taking a concentration and then you're calculating that out to how much energy, like it's taking it from a concentration to like an absolute value or like an actual like number in joules, which is our energy unit here.
Yeah, exactly. There are two problems with that. First, we assumed it's total lactate production, but it's probably not, because there's probably more lactate still in the muscles, and we didn't measure that.
Right.
And there's also differences between participants, probably in distribution, but also in lactate utilization before it reaches the earlobe and so on.
Yep.
So
yeah, and that's always been my biggest thing, is like you just have to make sure to say that is a limitation, right? Because we don't know how much of the lactate that is being produced from glycolysis is actually being uptaken into the mitochondria. We just know what the spillover is into the blood, right? And another thing I was just thinking about as you were explaining this is that you do 15-second all out, but then you just have an individual. Do you have them sit on the bike, or do you have them sit in a chair? It doesn't really matter, but
I had them on the bike, and
okay.
I told them to stay still on the bike. So
yeah,
they sprinted all out for 15 seconds, and then I just told them to sit still.
Right. And
even though
so my point is, or go ahead.
It's hard for most people to just stop after 15 seconds. Like,
yeah,
you want to go on, or the resistance is gone, and you just want to pedal it out.
Right.
And I had some people I had to tell once or twice to stop pedaling, but they all did that really well, even though it feels kind of unnatural.
Absolutely, but the reason for that, the rationale for that, is that if you're continuing to contract your muscles, you're going to be stimulating more energy demand, which is then potentially going to then start to pull lactate out, because you're not producing lactate from glycolysis anymore. Well, you most likely still are for some period of time, but now you're going the opposite way, where the mitochondria can start to uptake that lactate, clear the lactate out of the blood. So so that was something that kind of was like a little bit of an aha moment, was like, oh, well, if we have these individuals completely rest, then all that lactate that was produced during that 15 seconds and maybe a little bit afterwards now isn't going to be metabolized in the mitochondria, because there's not much, there's very, very little energy demand within the muscle now. So now all of that stuff is starting to seep into the blood, and that's why you have to wait, 5 to 6 to 7 minutes for some people for it to actually reach a peak.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we probably could get the lactate out faster if we had them pedal at no resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But then we would like there would be muscles that take up the lactate, and
Right.
yeah, so that's also one point that, I mean, we could try it out, but I think that's so technical.
Yeah,
I
because
don't
then
know
you
if
don't
there's
know,
any
like,
value
because
in that.
there's still some level of potential power output that's going on, and it's like to control something like that. This is like in this sort of situation, it's like splitting hairs, where it's just like let's just have them sit still, as long as they will sit still, and that's what that's what you as the investigator are there to do. Is like no, stay still. Like you're
Yep.
you gotta remind them. I have to remind people not to talk during my testing all the time because fluctuations in or talking leads to fluctuations in respiratory frequency and tidal volume and VO2 and all this other sort of crazy
Yep.
stuff. So it's all about saying it as nicely as possible, but getting them to do it, and sometimes just being like, nope, stop. Okay, so that's really cool. So you guys determined glycolytic energy contribution and its relationship
But
to
there's one problem in that, because we said that power output is related to fat-free mass,
Mhm.
and we just included fat-free mass in that calculation.
Right. Oh, so there's
So
could be some
yeah,
collinearity going on.
yes, exactly. But then we looked at the collinearity of those, of fat-free mass and of glycolytic contribution, and
Hmm.
while some was expected, it was actually lower than we expected. The R squared was somewhere around 0.5.
Hmm. Yep.
So that's how we included, or decided to include, those two in a multiple linear regression model.
Hmm.
And that actually explained over 90% of differences between all participants. And we also, like, the inclusion of fat-free mass was basically justified by us thinking about fat-free mass as one having a or more mechanical advantage over the cranks,
Hmm.
and also because phosphocreatine is mainly stored in muscle mass or in fat-free mass. That it's also some kind of metabolic predictor, as in the 15-second all-out sprint, most of the energy actually comes from phosphocreatine and ATP, or overall just phosphogen.
Mm.
So we basically combined the main contributors from a metabolic perspective. So phosphogen and glycolysis,
Hmm.
and those two, at least in our way of seeing it, explain most of the power outputs of our participants.
Yeah. Yeah, that was so the moral of the story is that, if you want to be a really, really good sprinter in these sort of situations, having a lot of muscle is pretty important. And we also have to clarify that these were like well-trained cyclists, or like people who had been cycling for extended periods of time too. So it wasn't just like a bodybuilder who had never cycled before. It was somebody who was familiar with cycling. So in terms of correlations, I'm sure if you got a bodybuilder that was totally unfamiliar with cycling, they wouldn't be to the same sort of comparison. Like you wouldn't have as tight of a correlation just because of the ability to transfer the mechanical energy to the pedals.
Yeah, probably.
Because there was somebody who was like had 90 kilograms of fat free mass in the study that I was looking at, and they were like, they were always the one that was like the very, very far end of the like the prediction equation. I was just like, holy crap, like that person is 220 pounds if they're 10% body fat. So they are a
Yes.
big person. And their power output was crazy too. It was, I don't even know what it was, but probably in the 12 to 1500 range in terms of peak power output.
I think over like 1500 peak, and I think 1300 watts average.
For 15 seconds.
Yes.
That's crazy. What's okay? So this is just for my curiosity. So somebody in the tour, like that's like deemed as a sprinter, what is their 15-second like peak power and then average power?
Um, I don't know. Actually, I think those values were higher, like 10 years ago. I think like Greipel and Kittel, the German sprinters, they had
Yep.
really high values, and I think there's more of a focus on like the aerodynamics of side of things.
Yeah. And
And just
probably just like the sheer amount of volume you have to do in order to complete the tour is just like it doesn't lend itself too well to having, they still have incredible numbers, but like if you looked at a track cyclist, like those guys are just like insane.
yeah. So I think like I think I don't know who it was. If it was it was one of the Germans. I think it was around 1800 watts peak. But track sprinters are over 2000. So yeah, there's the difference. But I still think like the modern day sprinters are at like 1600, 1500 peak power output.
Yeah, that's a lot. I think I was able to hit, like for a fraction of a second on whatever bike we did, like 1500 or 1600 at one point. It was like it was like blipped up, and then it was like, just precipitous fall, down to like 800 watts towards the end. If it was probably a Wingate test or something like that, but it was like, yeah, it was like I got lucky in terms of my ability to go that high. And I'm just like, these guys can hit it after 100 miles of riding in a sprint at the end, of their race. Anyways, aside, that's like, that's absolutely, that's cool. It seems like, you guys got a lot of, good participants and everything in the big takeaway, right? Or I guess in your own words from this study, what is the big takeaway, for the general public?
So when we include the delta lactate, that adds some value to prediction of power output. So the glycolytic contribution is obviously one main factor in sprinting. And when we arrive at a model that has such a high R squared or goodness of fit, we may question why we should measure lactate at all. But we also, when we measure lactate, at least that's the way I see it, is that probably those effects of distribution and lactate uptake by the mitochondria and so on in the time period after the sprint test is not as high as some people suggest it would be, or the difference between people is not in that regard is not as high as one might think it is.
Right. So the more important factors are the glycolytic distribution, which takes into account fat-free mass, and maybe a little bit to a lesser extent the true like delta lactate, right? Because the correlation, when you added delta lactate to that correlation, it increased it, but it wasn't like, going from 50 to 90%. It was like, I can't remember the numbers, but it was like, 70 to 80% or 80 to 90% or something.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is again, it's pretty interesting and, kind of still like it's valuable, right? It's valuable to understand kind of the inner workings of the body and all of that. But one of the things that I always ask or have been kind of pondering is like, well, if you had an individual eat different levels of carbohydrate, right, throughout, like before they did this sprint test, then how much is that going to change their lactate, but also how much is that going to change their sprint capability? And I wonder if it's, directly correlated, or like, is it less correlated than we actually think, which would then point a little bit more probably, well, that would be exogenous carbohydrates. Well, depending on when you start to implement that, right? You could put somebody on a high carbohydrate diet, moderate carbohydrate diet, low carbohydrate diet, have them do a sprint test, first week, second week, third week, and then see how that plays out. And that might be able to get at this idea of like, how important is like, say, dietary carbohydrate on sprint performance. You could also do it from an acute perspective, right? You have them come in and have, I don't know, 100 grams of carbohydrates right beforehand. Your lactate would probably be through the roof to start, like your resting lactate. And I don't know how much higher than it's going to go. I imagine that it probably would still reach some level of the same max, but it's going to be a lot more scrunch straight just because of the diet. And that's always something that I've always had people consider, is that diet affects lactate production. So just something to be aware of for people.
But I also had to think about that for a while. But I wanted to do something into that direction. But I said the reliability of the delta lactate is still excellent, but still there is a relatively high day-to-day variability. And I fear that we might not be able to measure those effects of diet, or it would take a really high number of participants to find out some small effect in diet or carbohydrate consumption or so on.
Yeah, because the variability in delta lactate is so high to begin with. It would be hard to detect small changes due to an effective diet.
And that I have to add, when we talked about the regression models and so on, that was when we took the average of our second visit to the lab and third combined. The goodness of it was a bit worse when we looked at individual visits to the lab, but not a huge amount.
Yeah. And that's the nature of everything. When you start to get to the individual level, it potentially starts to fall apart, right? There's some individuals who are really consistent. There's other individuals who, are hyper variable. And then, we have responders and non-responders and all of that. And that's why we do collect so much data, is to then say from a population level, what can we actually say? So I guess just to kind of wrap it up, what's your, would you recommend, people try to pursue measuring something like VLA Max based on kind of the protocols that we prescribed? And if they are able to measure it, is there a way of getting around the need, for this isokinetic ergometer? Like, can you get away with not doing that and get, most of the way there? Or do you think that is kind of a make or break?
What I would be really interested in is how differences in participants are in glycolysis are actually shown in the blood lactate values. So like when there's two people of different glycolytic ability, it would be nice to actually measure the difference between those two for the same power output. Let's take two people, or let's just make up two people of the same body weight, same fat-free mass, same power output. And when let's just say they have a 1 millimolar of difference in delta lactate, then that could potentially tell us that one is less glycolytic. But it could also tell us that one is less efficient, or more efficient, because it takes. Does he or she actually produce less lactate for the same amount, or is he or she not able to produce as much lactate? So that is always the case in the when we think about the sprint test. Is are we actually also limited by glycolysis or by metabolic factors, or are we limited by like biomechanical factors, such as the settings of the ergometer, or maybe just your bike fit? So
Right. I've seen people
yeah.
who, are totally inefficient, not because they're not capable physically of doing it, but because their bike fit is absolute garbage and their chin, their knees are touching their chest when they're riding, and it's just okay, we need to change this first. So it seems like there's a lot of questions that are still unanswered, about, the utility potentially and the ability to explain differences in VLA Max, that I think will give you a little bit of a job, going forward for the next couple of years, at least the next couple of years. And then, what's fun about research is that as you answer more questions, even more questions come up. Right. So, man, this has been super interesting. Are there any application or big change or big takeaways you want to give the guests? And then what's your direction, over the next few years as you finish up your PhD? Where are you going to go?
Like for what people can take away from this is,
Mm-hmm.
and also to answer your question before is, the limitation of the ergometer. I think if you can find out how you can produce the most power out on the road, you could potentially do a VLaMax test there.
Okay.
So if you know that up that hill in that gearing, you can go all out for 15 seconds and produce X amount of watts, and that's the most you ever produced, and you consistently produce that over or on that hill or whatever, I think you could potentially do a test there. But I
Mm-hmm.
would question, why would you measure lactate if you know your power output? Does that actually give you any more information?
Right.
Because you cannot say you're this glycolytic or that glycolytic or this efficient or that efficient, because that all goes into the lactate number, and you cannot say this part of lactate is my efficiency and this part is my maximum glycolytic ability, and so on. So I would say just test your peak and your mean power output
Mm-hmm.
over certain durations, and that's all there is to it right now.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in and what I'm going to do going forward is looking at the predictive value of VLaMax regarding endurance exercise. So is there actually any relationship between VLaMax and thresholds, however defined,
Yeah. Yeah.
between VLaMax and substrate utilization? So the theory is lower VLaMax means higher fat oxidation. Is there a relationship between VLaMax and cycling efficiency? And one other thing I want to look at is basically the I don't know, I'd probably say proof of concept is, can we change VLaMax? Can we actually train it?
Mm-hmm.
And what changes? Does the lactate accumulation for the same power output change? And do those changes, or are those changes reflected in endurance exercise? So can
Right.
I just give somebody less carbohydrates in their training and make their or lower their VLaMax because they're less glycolytic?
Right. And
And
does
then
that result in changes to their performance? Because that's the big thing, right?
yes,
Is you can manipulate something from a substrate perspective, but if it doesn't change their performance, then you're like, okay, well, you what's the point of manipulating that, right?
yeah, exactly. So that's the way I'm going. I try to go into in the future.
That
Um,
that
yeah,
That's awesome, man. I look forward to reading more of your articles that you publish, and I will for sure be. If I don't know if I've published this one before, but I'll definitely make a carousel post, of this study that we talked about, in conjunction with posting like the podcast and other things like that, because it's cool stuff, and we need more deep discussions about the utility of certain measurements and metrics and what we can actually do with them. So Benedict, thank you so much for coming on. is there a place that people can find you social media wise that you want to push them to, or do you just want to push them to reading your paper, which I can happily do?
I'm on most social networks, but I'm not really active on them. But I think the most productive way is to follow me on ResearchGate, because I try to upload most of my stuff. I'm not into I'm a passive person on Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram and so on. I try to consume as much as I can. But I don't feel like I can actually provide anything that is worthwhile. But
hey, don't say that.
Maybe I should think about that.
You should, because this was an amazing podcast all about VLA Max, and it certainly helped me think about it in a lot different light. And I hope that a lot of other people get really good value from everything we've talked about, right? To considerations with like the protocols, to what's the value of it, and what are all the questions that are still remaining, because there certainly seems to be a lot of questions regarding VLA Max. So I will certainly be tuning in to your articles when you publish them. So let me know when you publish them, and I'll push them to my Instagram. Everybody who's listening here, you know where to find me. Critical Oxygen or Critical O2 on Instagram, Critical Oxygen Podcast on Spotify or YouTube. If you have any questions for me or for Benedict, comment down below. Hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.